Welcome everyone back. I'm Steve Van Solobahir. I was at MIT when the election technology project started, voting technology project started, and continue to be involved in the activities that Charles and Mike and others organize. This panel has a nice mix of perspectives and views. We have people who do election administration, who do financial auditing, who specialize in the law, and who specialize in the business and research side of things. We're going to start with Ned Foley, who brings us the perspective of the legal aspects surrounding auditing elections and elections generally. He directs election law at Moritz at Ohio State University Law School. He has many accolades behind his name, as all of our panelists do. But in particular, I would call out, he's the author of a recent book, Ballot Battles, The History of Disputed Elections in the United States, which is a really great read and a great resource if you're interested in learning more about how we in the United States have kind of wandered to this point in our history. After Ned, we're going to hop over in highly nonlinear fashion to Ben Adida. Ben is the CEO of VotingWorks. He's been a production leader in Silicon Valley for the last 10 years. He's been researching and working on voting technology in particular for the last 20 years. He was a graduate student here at MIT and one of the first members, really, of the Voting Technology Project. So he's been involved from the get-go, and he's been really thinking very hard about how new technologies factor into what we do and how we can do things better. Then we will hop to, who will be the last? Okay, we'll hop to Bill?
No, me.
Matt? Okay, Matt. Matt Masterson is currently the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor at the Department of Homeland Security. He was commissioner at the Election Assistance Commission, which was an important outgrowth of the controversies surrounding the 2000 election and dealing with every matter since then. And formally, before that, he was the Chief of Staff and the CIO at the Ohio Secretary of State election. So this is the Ohio end of the board.
OH.
I-O.
We're the only two.
Yeah, I know. The Ohio end of the board. Yes.
And finally, Bill Kresse is currently the commissioner of the Chicago Board of Elections and an assistant professor, so two-hatted in the College of Business at Governor's College in Chicago. So he brings pretty unique and broad experience. He's also had enormous, extensive experience and expertise in financial forensics. So it's a very different perspective from election auditing, but it's really where a lot of the expertise in auditing comes from, and there are a lot of incredibly important lessons to learn from the financial forensics world. So we're going to hear four very different perspectives, but I think they're going to all dovetail nicely. So we'll start off with Ned.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Charles had asked us to, at least on this panel, to kind of reflect on everything that we've been doing over the last couple of days and then refract that through our own different disciplinary perspectives. So no PowerPoint for me, but some thoughts to share. And my first takeaway from the last couple of days is if we're thinking long-term about the improvement of election integrity, not just year to year, but maybe decade to decade, priority number one would be to teach statistics in K through 12 education. I did not have that, and I regret I didn't take it in college, but I have, throughout my professional life, thought that statistics would be incredibly valuable, and I have never once used trigonometry. And I think there's a real straightforward swap there, at some point that would really help civic literacy, because I think statistical literacy, I think, is part of civic literacy. And so if we're thinking about legacy of what this generation's folks who care about election integrity passes from one generation to the next, I would be thinking about how the work we do on a year-to-year basis should interface with improvement of civics education, and I would, seriously think about adding a component of that. And it relates to Philip's point. yesterday, I mean, transparency is an absolutely critical goal to election integrity, and Philip was making the case that risk-limiting audits are transparency, but maybe some of that transparency needs a couple of years of mathematics. And you know, it's not that every citizen has to understand every aspect of the electoral process. We can rely on ordinary voters taking cues from partisan leaders or the media or other sources of trusted information. But I think we have a ways to go before a sufficient percentage of our population is sufficiently familiar with some of the statistical literacy that might be necessary, and it should exist, but is not there yet. So I think how to improve that societal-wide is important. I enjoyed doing the experiment yesterday, but I guess I do want to add my thought that by the way, I came to this conference as a big fan of risk-limiting audits. As someone who doesn't know anything about statistics, but thinking, boy, that's the gold standard, that's where we should be going. And I'm still definitely a fan of them, but one of the things that has happened for me over the last couple of days is this transfer to the notion, maybe Mike Alvarez and others have talked about it, is broadening it out to the concept of election integrity more broadly, and where do particular kinds of audits fit into the overall goal of verification and integrity and so forth. And I did think that if that experiment was designed to sort of increase confidence in this particular technique as a way to assess variability of an electoral process, it frankly did not work for me. Where's Paul Grunke? Is he still with us? All right, anyway, he was part of my group, and boy, you know, talk about human error. I hate to say it. Yeah. But I think if he were here, he would acknowledge that he miscounted playing cards several times. If Neil hadn't been part of our group, we wouldn't have understood the instructions or what to do or why we were doing it. And so I would say, you know, that, again, I'm a big believer in audits and stuff, but that experiment did not match up with what I think the goals of the experiment were. But with that aside, let me in thinking more broadly, one of the things that I've been doing over the last few years is I've been involved with a project run by something called the American Law Institute, which is a group of judges, practicing lawyers, folks that we know. Mark Elias was involved in the project, Ben Ginsberg, a bunch of other leading election law practitioners. We had federal judges, state Supreme Court justices, a lot of academics, but mostly on the law side, people that you would know, like Rick Hasen and Heather Gerken and Rick Pildes. Some people in this room were involved in this project. John Fortier was very helpful. And what the goal of this project, by the way, ALI itself does things like the Model Penal Code and the Uniform Commercial Code and other efforts to improve various elements of law, contract law, torts law, criminal law, et cetera, et cetera. They had never tackled election law until, again, about a few years ago, where they asked me and my colleague Steve Huffner at Ohio State to lead this effort to come up with principles and standards for dealing with the vote counting process. So we took a long look at that. It was a long process. It is now finally done, which is really good news. It's available on their website electronically. We're going to get hard copy in the next couple of months from the book publisher. So let me say a little bit about that and how it interfaces with the concepts of audits. We actually do mention audits in that project. We think that they should be part of the overall process of counting ballots and verifying the accuracy of counts. We don't say risk-limiting audits specifically, but we do say audits conducted in a statistically appropriate manner is the standard, the language of the standard there. But that project was subdivided into 3 different components. The first component was certification of the canvas or certification of the returns, and what are the rules and principles should guide that as sort of best practices. And that would be true for every election regardless of the margin of victory. And so one thought that I had yesterday and today is I was asking myself, what are the minimal basic procedures that every election should have before you reach certification? I think that's a question that we should ask, and I would encourage, it's as important as to have a conference on auditing. I don't know that I've ever been to or aware of a conference on the concept of certification and what is the necessary ingredients for a certification in any election. And again, you might differentiate that you might want some variability. Are the standards and procedures you use different from statewide elections versus local elections, sort of high prominent elections like governor's races or congressional races versus less prominent races? We did separate presidential elections as requiring a whole different set of procedures, mostly because of the incredibly difficult deadlines if you have a difficult presidential election, as we know from Florida 2000, you've got to wrap everything up in 5 weeks, and that's really tight time frame. So, anyway, so conceptually, and again, we have some rules and standards that connect to certification. I won't go into all the details, but for this group, and we'd love to interact more with the election officials, as many of us have said over the last couple of days, those of us who are academics. But what are the essential ingredients for any certification to think, here we have an actual result? The second component of the project was recounts, standards, rules, and principles for recounts. For those elections where certification is not enough, but you want to review the certification to make sure it's accurate. And again, you have is a margin of victory 0.5% or 0.25%. Again, does it depend on a statewide race or a local race? We needed to think about what variation there should be across state lines, different states, laboratories of democracy, and a principle of federalism that lawyers focus on, or to what extent there should be uniform standards across all elections in all states. We struggled with that. One question that's come up is whether or not these risk-limiting audits or these very sophisticated statistical audits should be pre-certification or post-certification. I think that goes to what you want the certification to stand for, and then what you want a post-certification recount to do. And I think, I hate to add confusion to terminology, because we started the conference yesterday thinking that uniformity of terminology was important, but I could imagine us thinking about the concept of a risk-limiting recount, not just a risk-limiting audit, right? I mean, some states, Ohio being one of them, starts a recount with X percentage of the ballots, and you only move to a larger percentage of the ballots in a recount if you feel the need to do so. Again, and depending upon what you want your recount to do, you might not need to recount every ballot. The final thing, the stage of our project was what's known as judicial contest of election results. And that's when a candidate and their lawyers say, we don't accept the certification, we don't accept the recount, we think there's some fundamental flaw, and we want to go to court and sue over it. And we have some standards and procedures for what sort of things can be contested and how the contest should go. And by the way, not all things can be contested. Whitney, I think, used the term tragic to refer to the lost votes as a result of the bad ballot design in Florida this year. And tragic's a pretty strong word, but that's something that even if it's true, you can't win a judicial contest on everything that goes wrong in an election. And one of the themes that we dealt with is, again, what errors are fixable and what do you have to leave for the next election, and recognize that democracy is an iterative process. It's not just this year's election that matters, it's an ongoing thing. And by the way, this is a theme that goes all the way back to beginning of American history. As Steve mentioned, I wrote this book. And this debate was between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. When they had their disputed elections way back in the beginning, Madison's view is we've got to get the correct answer in this election right. We cannot tolerate an error in the vote counting process in this particular election. Hamilton said, no, 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 no. That's too difficult a standard. At some point, you have to stop the counting process and say, we have to have a winner. And you know what? There's going to be another election 2 years later, 4 years later, whatever, and win that one. And so what's our standard of optimality? Because we're never going to have perfection. So we need to figure out what is an appropriate standard. I know I have to wrap up. The last point I'll make is that many of the problems that we've been talking about as the ones most likely to cause anxiety among voters and the public about not having confidence in the election don't involve tabulation software and the things that the audit narrowly understood cover, things like ballot design. I mean, we think about things like long lines, and have voters been turned away because of long lines. Things about, has voter ID laws caused people to not be able to vote, or decide I'm not going to try to get that ID or whatever. Wrongful purging of voter registration lists. The wrong assignment to precincts that Michael McDonald and others have talked about. Again, some of these things can be handled in a judicial contest, some cannot. It seems to me that what the audit is designed to do is to find problems that are not superficially transparent, right? In other words, the hidden problems that you might not be aware of, because we can rely on the competitiveness of elections and the lawyers involved. Particularly in high-stakes election, your parties and their lawyers are going to be looking for things to litigate over if it's worth litigating. And so like the North Carolina race that's going on right now, that's surfaced without an audit, right? I mean, in other words, we've got an absentee ballot issue. I don't know how it's going to end up, whether it's going to overturn the result of the election, and whether or not that's but North Carolina didn't certify that race because this emerged. So some problems are discoverable without some of these auditing mechanisms. Last point: do we need to audit every year? I mean, we do the census every 10 years to achieve one person, one vote. But we know that mid-decade, there's been deviation of population, so it's not perfectly one vote. So we update our population evaluations every 10 years, and we think that's good enough. Us in academia, our law school gets audited by the National Association of Law Schools every 7 years. We don't get updated every year. So what's necessary to certify this election isn't necessarily the same set of practices that decade to decade you say, is the system running? So you may want to randomly sample some elections every so often to check the integrity of the process, and that's a different set of procedures that you use each and every time you run an election. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ben.
All right, give me a second while a little technical assistance here. Beautiful.
You got it.
That was great. All right.
Oh, wait a second.
No, it just takes a second.
It wasn't up there.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Well, we can invite everyone to come down and look.
I think if you can you drag the window over after you do present? Huh.
Yeah.
Is this?
I thought I could do it in 10 minutes, but
It had to come with the gag control.
There you go. Here it comes. It's getting.
Yeah, the only thing is I do that. I will stand up then, because I will not see it on the screen.
Oh.
It'll only be up there.
Okay, well,
Cool. All right. So if I look back at the screen, it's because I can't see it here. Okay. So I come from Silicon Valley, which means I have to have slides. Sorry. I'm with an organization called VotingWorks that we just started. You may have heard about me in Josh's talk, which was obviously way too nice to me. VotingWorks is a nonprofit that is building open source, classic, paper-based, risk-limiting audit enabling voting machines. If you want to talk more about that, happy to find you offline. We're looking at first pilots in 2019. So that's VotingWorks. And even though I love the end-to-end verifiability stuff, that's not what we're doing with VotingWorks at the moment. So, I was asked to give some thoughts on everything we've talked about. So the disclaimer is these are very early, very raw thoughts. If they come off in any way as trying to tell election officials how to do their job, that is not my intent. They're just meant to be very initial reflections on what I heard. I want to say three things. I want to talk about complexity, I want to talk about operationalizing, and I want to ask the questions, do audits ever fail? So complexity. There's a quote attributed to Albert Einstein, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. The original quote is actually, it can scarcely be denied that the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. I'm glad he took his own advice on that quote. There's a great paper, and I come from a world of building large software systems, that I strongly recommend, if you haven't seen it, that you check it out. It's called How Complex Systems Fail. It is written by Richard Cook, who is originally an anesthesiologist who thinks about patient safety. Please check it out. It's 2 pages of extremely dense ideas about how complex systems, be they whatever they are, how they fail. And the way that I would summarize it is complex systems fail in complex ways, in nonlinear ways. So if you add a little bit of complexity, you add a little bit more complexity, you add a little bit more complexity, no single amount of complexity feels like on its own it's going to be a problem. But when it all adds up, it adds a ton more problems than you initially anticipated. And the failures are very complex. So the one that I always remember from elections is the 2006 election, where I was a poll worker here in Massachusetts, where lots of precincts in Boston ran out of ballots. Why did they run out of ballots? It's a very long story, but it starts with the fact that for the first time in a long time, there were 2 sheets in the ballot. And so there weren't enough ballots that could fit in the ballot carriers. And then there were vans that were laid out that could deliver the ballots to all the precincts, because they kind of foresaw that this was going to be a problem. Except the vans, the ballots started running out right around rush hour, and the vans started getting stuck in traffic and weren't able to deliver the additional ballots when they were needed. There's a really long report by David King, I think, that talks about this in 2006, and it is the ultimate representation of how complex systems fail in complex ways, and I love it. So how does that apply to audits, right? And my reaction to everything we've heard is, can we relentlessly simplify everything we've heard? Can we make it simpler in explanation? My immediate reaction was the Bayesian audit sounded simpler than the risk-limiting audit. That's just my raw reaction. Can we make all those explanations simpler, right? Can we make everything simpler in operation? In every aspect of the risk-limiting audit, can we think of every step and say, is there a way to make it simpler? And I don't know the answer to this. Again, I'm not trying to lecture and say, I'm just coming at this system, at this problem from my experience in large software systems, where what I try to do is relentlessly simplify every step. When you look at a single step, again, it's not going to feel like that additional bit of complexity is that meaningful. But you have to remember that it interacts with every other bit of complexity and every other component of the system. So can we relentlessly fight for simplicity? And can we make it hard to screw up, right? Can we make it really difficult to screw up the actual auditing process? I don't have the answer to this. It's just a question I hope that we're all asking ourselves. Operationalizing, second point. Aviation medicine, modern software incident response, they all perform complex tasks under time pressure and other constraints by operationalizing via checklists. If the checklist manifesto is not on your reading list, I strongly recommend it. It'll take you about 2 hours to read, and to me, it was life-changing. I know that election officials are already really good at this because in the operation of elections themselves, there's tons of checklists, right? And there's a lot of this philosophy of operationalizing everything in very clear, linear ways that you have to follow. And I heard, so reflecting back what I heard a lot of these efforts beginning to happen. Jennifer talked a lot about and is working on a lot of these guidebooks and instruction booklets on how to run these risk-limiting audits. And I think that's fantastic. My only point here is let's double down on that. Let's go even further. Let's standardize ruthlessly how we do these audits. Let's, apparently I'm being very ruthless today because there's a lot of ruthlessly simplifying, very ruthless. Checklists for everything. Can we force it down to a process that is extremely clear and has this philosophy of the checklist? I do want to point out that there's one additional complication that, again, Jennifer and I talked about in the hallway conversation about the fact that staffing changes from election to election, poll workers, et cetera, and that is hard, right? That's like, typically, you know, when your surgeon's operating on you, they didn't just come in with 2 hours of training off the street, right? So that additional bit of complexity makes me think and made Jennifer think about, can we learn something maybe from the military? The military thinks a lot about checklists and operationalizing things with folks that only have a certain amount of training and where the staffing changes all the time. So how do we think about operationalizing all of this? Via checklists, via simplification? Those are my first 2 points. And my last point is, do audits ever fail? This talk covered a lot about audit success. But a lot of the hallway conversations I heard were about failures and rough edges. And I don't mean outright failures. I mean small failures here and there. And one thing that I am adamant about in anything that has any level of complexity is that we have to talk about failures. Folks in the medical space talk about having a journal of negative results. They kind of joke about it. I'm not sure it's actually ever come about, but like there's never, we have to talk about failures and things that don't work out, right? Could we have a conference about just audit failures? The whole thing is just talking about how the audits failed, right? I think that'd be pretty cool, because I don't think we can learn to do this well if we're not talking at least as much about failures as we are about successes. I think what makes this particularly hard is that the audits themselves feel very critical. Like if an audit fails in any small or even medium way, that feels like, ooh, that has a lot of weight. But I think we have to think about that. We have to think about how hard the first inconclusive audit is going to be. There's gonna be one, right? I mean, we saw yesterday during the simulation, there was one audit that didn't complete, right? How hard is it gonna be when there's a first audit that overturns a result? I mean, hopefully there's going to be one. Otherwise, what's the point of these audits, right? Like, were we just all perfect, and the audits were just going to confirm that we were all perfect all along? In software, there's a thing about when you write a test, a unit test or an integration test, and that test never fails, it's not a good test, right? You write a test, and like the first thing you do is like, can I make sure this test fails? Ah, yes, it fails. Okay, now when it succeeds, it actually means something, right? So should audits ever fail? They probably will. And if we don't talk about these failures enough, then we're not going to be ready for how catastrophic a failed audit will be the first time it actually happens. So complexity, operationalizing, and do audits ever fail? Turning it into actions. Can we simplify? Can we checklistify? And can we discuss failures? Thank you.
Got it. Well, I feel like a complete failure, as Ben created PowerPoints in the overnight, and I drank beer and apparently wrote John Nash-style random musings on note cards. So we're going to do, I literally wrote squirrel on one of the note cards for my ADD. So no, I appreciate Charles. Thank you. Thank you to everyone here. I appreciate everyone staying. I had a fear that it was going to be Charles and I and this panel just hanging out, shooting the shit about this. So just want to break down, again, the idea is to break down thoughts and concerns. I should have introduced myself, I guess, but Matt Masterson, DHS. I'm fortunate enough to now be at Homeland Security after being at the AC and then working in elections in Ohio. And so my starting point is really to look at my own journey in this and see how far we've come. I think one of the things we have to do if we're going to look forward is to look backward. And I was struck by the slide from NCSL at the number of states that have audits on the books, right? That's not good enough. We recognize now a need for efficient effect. When I started in this business, the need to audit was not a recognized thing in most jurisdictions. And so the fact that there's a recognition of the need to audit and then to audit well is an incredible progression in a very quick amount of time in elections. We don't do anything quickly in elections for good reason, right? We want to phase things in. We freaking love pilots for exactly that reason, right? Because in the end, what we're talking about here and what we talk about constantly DHS with election officials is managing risk, right? Identifying and understanding what are the risks in the process, what are the risks to the process, and how do we manage those risks. And I think the brilliance behind risk limiting audits for me that really it should have resonated earlier as I've watched them and participated in them is the recognition that there is an inherent risk level, that there isn't 100% certainty in the process that is elections. Election officials know that, those of you who have worked with election officials, but the inherent recognition that we're not going to get to 100% I think is critical. We used to talk about at the AC all the time, what is our assumed level of risk with the VVSG, but never actually got to metrics around it. And so what I appreciate with the risk limiting audit thought process is that recognition of risk level and talking about risks. So we've made this progress. There's a recognition that we need certain core principles. I think VVSG 2.0 captures these, and I'd love to see that become a reality in there. But there's a recognition in the community through that process. Elections have to be verifiable for voters, right? Elections have to be auditable, and they have to be accessible, right? We can talk about all of this, and Josh talked a little bit about the conversation that we had with security folks and accessibility folks. It's not one or the other. It's not a balance. They must be accessible and they must be auditable and secure, right? That there's no trade-off there. And I think Whitney captured very well and very eloquently, we cannot ask voters to trade off their access for that need for auditability. And so we need to continue to push ourselves to understand the risks that are introduced if we ask them to do that. How do we build, this is in part from my experience working in this community, having these conversations, and honestly, I think some of the challenges that we've seen since 2016 and going forward as far as level of trust. A lot of folks in here have said, well, you have to build trust with the election officials. The election officials need to trust us. And it struck me in these conversations that it's not just trust. It's not just, okay, you need to trust me in my math, or you need to trust me in my processes. It's an actual, I think, empathy. I think all of us need to recognize in an empathetic way the roles that we're all playing and what we do. And my twin brother, is an empathetic market researcher. I don't know what that means. I thought it meant that he just sits on a couch and talks about feelings. It appears that's not actually what that means. But as I've worked with him and talked with him about what he does, what it's really about is gaining that full understanding of the other person, the other entity, and what their challenges, what their needs are in order to be able to bring your point of view to bear effectively, right? And so as I heard some of the conversation here, conversations where things were said, it's simple. Everyone could do this. Anyone can understand that. Anyone gets that. Well, that's a really unempathetic point of view, candidly. And election officials that push back, honestly, on academia and others and say, you don't understand what we're going through. You don't understand what our challenges are or how the process actually works. That undermines what is a large amount of academic work that has gone on to do exactly that, to understand the election process. And so I think, and this goes for me probably more than anyone, it's understanding what are those needs. What are those, okay, I may be able to understand it if I had the time to read your paper, if I had the time to implement those resources, if I had the time to come out to your office and physically locate myself in the elections office, but I have classes to teach and grants to pursue, right? What are those resource and workloads and understanding for election officials? Time is their most valuable asset. We talk a lot about money. Every election, every day, we're closer to another election, and they can't get that day back. So it may seem like nothing for you to say, can we spend a day talking through this? That's a lot in an elections office, because you're closer, and they're not just running elections every 2 years, right? Louisiana, Kansas, other states, they run elections every week. And they have other jobs. I recently talked to an election official in Missouri. She had 3 people in her office. Her other duties as assigned included, and I don't even understand this, managing the water table. I have no idea what that means. I guarantee it's important in that county in Missouri, though. I guarantee that, right? So you think it's that simple, but the reality is, for all of us, is having that empathy to understand the environments that folks are coming from, the amount of work. I mean, some of the academics in this room have dedicated incredible amount of time and work to truly improve the process because they care deeply about it. And we need to recognize as election officials, we're not the only ones that care deeply about the process, right? Let's see here, my random musings. Squirrel. That'll work, by the way. I'll just get up and wander out at some point. As we look at the auditability and the principles, I will say from the Department of Homeland Security's perspective, and Secretary Nielsen's been very outspoken on this, she's challenging me, the community, to get to 100% auditable records by 2020. She's been very clear that she views that as a national security issue. And then the challenge is how to implement efficient and effective audits with that auditability, right? How do we pursue and push forward and lead in doing that? And in doing that, we have to anchor ourselves in understanding the risks. I thought the presentations today, talking about the additional risks in the elections process, not just the tabulation, registration challenges that Michael, or precincting challenges that Michael highlighted, registration systems. Just if you're going to go talk to an election official about auditing and risk limiting audits, what you're asking them to ignore is their inherent instinct and understanding of the human element. You're telling me hand counting is going to get me. I understand why that's important. I agree. But you're telling election officials to ignore mountains of evidence that they have that shows just how impactful human error and the human element is on the election process, right? And that is a major challenge. They know what poll workers can do. Except for Washington and Oregon, yada, yada, yada. No, but honestly, why have Washington, Oregon, and California headed that direction? To manage risk. They knew the inherent risk that poll workers and humans bring to the process and are trying to manage it in their way, right? That's what's happening. And so when you go talk about this, recognize that when you're making the case, you have to understand that inherently for an election official, you're introducing more of the human element and the challenges that presents. That's not unachievable. It's a conversation that needs to be had, but that's part of understanding the challenges and risks that it presents. What almost every election official recognizes is the human element is the ultimate risk to the process in running elections. And then finally, understanding the governance structure. I thought the NCSL presentation was really, really good, and there was a really good theme that developed through the conversations that legislators play an important role, helping them understand what this is, and that if you legislate specific procedures and practices, it's going to inhibit our ability to innovate. I am incredibly optimistic. I truly believe that the area of fastest growth for all of us is going to be auditing. And it's going to be auditing, one, because there's an acceptance in the community that it needs to happen, but two, there's an acceptance in our society that auditing is an important principle, technique, skill set. It's something we do in our society, and so we know how to do it and innovate on it well. And it would be a shame if we locked ourselves in to one way of doing things when we could get really good and efficient. Because in the end, what I've seen from risk limiting audits, understood from this conference, is they're not only more effective, but they're more efficient. You're saving that time and money that election officials otherwise don't have available or could reallocate. That is the ultimate selling point. There is no election official I know that if you can show to them tangibly they're going to save time and they're going to save money, that they're not going to be interested in doing something, because in the end, that's their goal on a daily basis, so that they can spend it, managing risk in other areas. And then finally, avoiding the Lord of the Rings, avoiding my precious, right? The one to rule them all. There is no one silver bullet that solves the risk management process in elections. I think you said it perfectly. This is complex, and the risks are complex, and they're compounding. And so we need to avoid, if you do this one thing, you're good to go, because that's not reality in elections. There are baselines, there are standards that we need to establish, which we've talked about, but there's no one thing that really helps us manage that risk. And so then understanding, if you're doing this thing, if you're doing risk limiting audits, what does that mean I can do in other areas of my process to offer greater accessibility, to offer additional risk, take on additional risk, because I have those risk limiting audits on the back end. And so, really understanding, and then the one thing I fear that kind of got raised yesterday, and so I jotted it down quick, don't move the goalposts on us. Don't move the goalposts on the election officials and say, if you do this, hey, this is the gold standard, you're good to go, and then come back a year later and say, that's not good enough anymore, you now need to be doing this. We can iterate together. That's good, healthy, but election officials are going to invest time, resources, they're going to go talk to their legislators, and then if the goalpost moves while they're in the middle of this, they're going to lose that trust that there's a step forward. So for me, the path forward is not simple, it's complex. Building on the progress that's made, I mean, freaking New Jersey is trying to do risk limiting audits. I dream, I'm not kidding. I dream of a day that Bob Giles and Ron Rivest are throwing dice together up in Jersey. That did happen yesterday. I think so. Yeah. I mean, the progress is real. We have to get the common data format done. We have to get the common data format done. Agree on it and move it forward, please. 2 is education, not just of election officials. You need to have. And Philip, we're not quite there yet, but we need that elevator speech for what this is for legislators. Yeah. Not quite there, because legislators and those who need to invest in this need to understand quickly. You're going to get 5 minutes, and then you're out the door. And then this is a general commentary on managing risks and providing support. We need to invest in our election infrastructure wholly, and that starts with the state and local governments that own elections. You don't get to own something without investment. And so regular investment in election infrastructure, supporting election officials, has to be an ongoing conversation from everyone in this room. So I'm done, and
Thank you.
That was like 5 minutes.
Bill Kresse.
Hello. I'm on, yes. While Claire's setting up, thank you. One thing I have to say, all opinions and positions of Commissioner Kresse are his own and intended for educational purposes only, and do not necessarily reflect the opinions and positions of the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. Please, no wagering. Okay. I was told that this panel was to talk about what we heard about, the last day and a half from different perspectives. And as you'll see, I figured for my presentation, I will do it from the different hats that I wear, because I wear a number of hats. All right, where's my little clicker? There it is. All right. All right. So I'm commissioner of the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners. There are 3 commissioners. I'm one of them. How many any election commissioners in here? Election authorities of any nature. Okay, we got 1. Okay, I got a few. Okay. So move your arms, people. It won't get frostbite, okay? Really. All right, so we got a few. All right. I am a certified public accountant. Any CPAs in here? And the cheese stands alone. Okay. I worked for a couple of years at Deloitte, one of the big 4 accounting firms in the audit division in Chicago. And as I was telling some people earlier, most fun you can do as a CPA, is get into, as I did, into forensic accounting and fraud examination. I was doing audits of banks that were shut down, which is the most fun because the first thing you do, you don't want to have a run on the bank. So you meet with the officials in the back of a Denny's And you all get in one car, you roll in, and you show, the guys from Washington show their badges. I had my business card. And we shut it down. First thing we do, we take all the cash out of the place and put it in boxes. We get a truck come take all the cash, and we say, hey, see you on Monday. What a great way to rob a bank. Anyway, so I was a CPA for a number of years. I'm a certified fraud examiner. Any certified fraud examiners in here? Okay, once again, I'm a unicorn. All right. After working at Deloitte, I went off to law school at the University of Illinois in Champaign. Sorry, not Ohio State. And I worked as a courtroom litigator for some of the biggest firms in the city of Chicago. I was also a law clerk to a federal judge named Abraham Lincoln Moravitz in Chicago. He was an incredibly interesting guy. Best buddies with Frank Sinatra. He would take me to Sinatra concerts with him. It was incredible. All right, and I am currently, then I got rid of that and went back to school, got a couple more degrees, and became a professor. I was at one university for about 20 years, and now at Governor State University. As we like to say, we're the State University of suburban Chicago, okay? Because there's 3 in the city and 1 out in the suburbs. So we're named Governor State. We're named after the governors of the state of Illinois. Okay? In recent history, 40% of them have gone off to federal prison. Mostly for fraud. I am known as Professor Fraud. I've gotten the tag as a news director or news producer in Chicago, started calling me Professor Fraud. The name stuck. I've trademarked it. Okay? I make speeches around the country on fraud, and I say I'm from Governor State University. Nobody knows where it is. I say it's outside Chicago. They're like, oh, then you know about fraud. Okay, immediate street cred coming from Chicago. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is look at the things that have been discussed in the last day and a half from my different, perspectives. First, as an election commissioner, okay, I love the idea, okay, of the risk limiting audit. I really do. But again, it terrifies me in another set when you look at the size of Illinois and the size, we're talking about in Chicago. Illinois, we have approximately 7,000 units of local government in the state of Illinois. Okay, we have by far more units of local government than any state, like 2,000 more than the next one. That was because a great example of unintended consequences. 1870 Illinois Constitution, as a financial responsibility measure, put a part in the Constitution that said no local government could have bond issues more than 5% of the assessed valuation of the property within its jurisdiction. So when a town pushed up against that 5%, what'd they do? They created another unit of local government. So we've got school boards, water reclamation districts. My favorite is the mosquito abatement districts. My favorite, one little tiny suburb of Chicago has one park, 1 block by 1 block by 1 block. They have a park district that has its own police department. They had 32 officers. They were mostly drug dealers who got a gun and a badge. It was a big scandal, but that's my life, people. So we have 50,000 elected officials in Illinois. Okay, that's why again in November this was the ballot every Chicagoan got. Okay, 2-sided, printed. We were so happy we didn't fill up the whole 4th page. But there were over 400 versions of this ballot. Because when you have that many units, you've got, jurisdictional lines cutting in and out. So we had to have over 400 versions. We had some precincts that would have 2 or 3 different versions within the precinct. In Illinois, well, we look at how many precincts we have. We have 2,000 precincts just in the city of Chicago. State law says a precinct should be approximately 400 people. So we have, apartment complexes with more than 1 precinct in the complex. And so on election day, we have to hire 13,000 people just for 1 day of work, okay? But, and this is why I love the RLA, okay, right now state law says we have to do a 5% audit. It costs us, and I've talked to various people at the board, depending on what costs you include, anywhere between at least $25,000 to about $500,000 to conduct that audit. The RLA, I'm convinced, would save us a lot of money. Okay, take off the election commissioner hat. Let's turn on my CPA hat, okay? First of all, hello, you're speaking our language, okay? Please, let's do some outreach to the certified public accountants. They do auditing, and I'll tell you, again, they would love to do this stuff. It's so much more interesting than a financial audit. Okay, this is like shutting down a bank, okay? But the language is the same. There are a lot of commonalities here that we could learn from each other, okay? Again, consider involving them. One of the things, just to throw out, spitball here, the explosive growth in vote by mail. Illinois, it's no longer absentee balloting. It's no excuse to vote by mail. You don't have to be sick or bedridden or out of town. You want to vote by mail, you can vote by mail. As a result, in this last election in Chicago, we had 116,000 requests for a ballot with an 87% return. That should be more. We had more vote by mails than we had during World War II from all the soldiers requesting ballots in this last election. CPAs know anything that's come in, and there's questions about, how do we know that those ballots are coming in from the actual voters or not? The CPA would say simple. We do the same testing that we do with accounts receivable. Mail them a confirmation. Did you send in a ballot? Did you mail it in? Did you drop it off? How did it get here? Okay, let's think about it. All right, as a certified fraud examiner, again, none in the room, but again, yes, they speak your language, okay? And we say in the information about being a CFE, we're all about detecting, preventing, and deterring fraud. Detecting is too late. That's, the horse has gotten out of the barn. But you're trying to find out how did that fraud take place and how much got lost. Okay, preventing is putting the controls in place. Okay, but deterring is messing with people's heads. Okay, and this is one reason we really have to get people to realize all the work that goes on post-election, auditing the results, and the work that we put in place to make sure that their ballots are counted and it's an open, fair, and free election. Okay, because as I say, there are two sides of deterrence. One is that deterrence on one side of people, fraudsters are economic creatures. They measure the costs and the benefits. If they think they're going to get caught and they're going to be punished, they won't do the crime. Okay, so that's one thing that we do, deterrence. But there's the flip side, and that's in organizations where there is no visible deterrence, the good people get discouraged. Okay, and I see this all the time in Chicago and Illinois. There's an old line we say in Illinois. In Illinois, our elections aren't broken, they're fixed. Okay. There was that recent survey in, I think it was April, Suffolk University, which I'm told is around here somewhere, and USA Today, on asking people, why didn't you register to vote when you could? And if you were registered, why didn't you vote? And for years, we've been making our election systems easier because we thought, people didn't vote because it was too inconvenient. We had to make it easier for them. And this survey kind of goes, no, they're discouraged. And a lot of voters think because the fix is in anyhow, it doesn't make a difference, okay? And I think if we showed them that, no, the elections aren't fixed, okay, you can make a difference. Maybe we'll get better numbers on our turnouts, okay? And as a lawyer, okay, and this has been mentioned several times, gotta get that elevator speech better, okay? As I say, I was a CPA and a law clerk in federal court in Chicago. We've got, I think we had about 20 federal judges in the federal building at that time. Almost a week didn't go by, I didn't get summoned to some other judge's chambers because the word went out, Judge Moravitz has a CPA on his staff. And I had to go and describe the difference between a debit and a credit, okay? They really don't know all this stuff. And if not the judge, their law clerks don't know. That's that. We go into litigate RLA, okay? That might work in a classroom at MIT. That's not going to work in a courtroom, okay? And we also have to get the media to understand as well. So we have to come up with presentations that are both judge-friendly, media-friendly, and jury-friendly. And again, even better branding, but don't use this acronym I came up with. Yeah, that wouldn't work too well. Risk-informed governance for greater election. Yeah, it spells out rigged. No, you don't want that. Oh, okay. I had another one that spelled out Russia, and I didn't want that one either. Okay. And finally, as an academic, okay. As I said, what's the biggest challenge to academic researchers? And I said, okay, number one, funding. Okay, well, number two is what? Access to data, all right? And I know when I was doing some research, I was trying to access police files at the Chicago Police Department. Kept running up into a brick wall. Then I started teaching fraud examination at the Chicago Police Department. Made a lot of connections, made a lot of friends, and as a result, I got unprecedented access to Chicago police files on identity theft. Wrote one of the biggest, big research paper on identity theft. It's been published elsewhere, okay? It's sort of like, the old saying in Chicago, it was a famous story of someone went to volunteer for a political campaign and was told, who sent you? He said, well, no one, I just came on his own. And was told, we don't want no one who no one sent, okay? So you gotta have a friend. Guess what? Everyone in this room, you now have a friend in Chicago, okay? And a lot of you already knew Lance Goff, our executive director, okay? We wanna work with you, okay? Our stuff is open, all right? So come to Chicago for election data. We're open, transparent, and we'll show you our modern equipment. Anyone else in here remember those old voting machines? Okay, yes, thank you. Fellow AARP members, okay. But, last week. Okay. Well, that, by the way, is a Cook County machine. And you can tell the difference. Just a little trivia here. Cook County machines, they would have the political parties listed horizontally, right?
So 2 counties, my county, we vote on a full-page ballot. My county does columns and rows. The next county does rows and columns.
Rows and columns, okay. Yeah, in Chicago, they had to pay extra to have them designed so there would be, the parties would be in columns. And why was that? Because then your precinct captain would sit there, I'd go into the polling booth, close the curtain behind me, and by how I shifted my weight on my foot, they could tell when I voted for the other party. So they deliberately had it done so they could do that. And then on the way out, the precinct captain would say, oh, I thought you wanted your garbage picked up, Don't vote that way anymore. Anyway, that would be the least of your problems. Okay. And come to Chicago, stay for the food, okay? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm changing my flights. Come on. And finally, if you want more, if you want to contact me, that's my website, professorfraud.com. I'm also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @ProfessorFraud. My Facebook page, I'll probably have some photos of this place. I already do, I think, up there. But yeah, I'm Professor Fraud, and it's trademarked, so don't you dare use it or I'll sue you. Okay, let the discussion begin.
Yes. All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Take some questions from the audience.
Questions, or I'll phrase it as a question.
All right.
Ned Foley, this is my question, would you please retract your implication that audits don't have to be done every year? 2 things, process audits
need to be done continuously. You don't have to audit the same process every year. I mean, some year you can do mail-in ballot returns, some year you can do whether or not the municipal clerks know how to do a pre-election voting machine test. But there's enough process audits that you can be kept busy every year doing at least one of them. And the second thing with election audits, election outcome audits, you can compare your voting machine to an ATM. However often you want your ATM to be checked to make sure that it's crediting deposits to the right accounts, you can say, I'm that comfortable with my voting machine crediting the votes to the right candidates. So, I mean, every election has someone with the means, motive, and opportunity to mess with it, and it's not like certifying an academic program. Certifying election or verifying election is like making sure the ATMs are working continuously and well all the time. So those are my thoughts on, yes, we do have to have some kind of quality management assurance monitoring all the time, and every election does need to be checked for accuracy. Comment?
Thank you. No, I completely agree that every election needs to be checked for accuracy. And that's why I framed it as what is essential to certify the results in every election. I think, and if in a particular jurisdiction using a particular kind of technology, the correct judgment is we don't have a sufficient level of assurance that we've got right results without an audit, then I would say an audit is essential for that jurisdiction pre-certification, and that answers in that context that would answer the question for me whether or not the audit must be done prior to certification or afterwards. Because if you basically say we can't trust an outcome without an audit in this jurisdiction, then you need to do it before certification, and it needs to be to the level of producing the requisite trust. But I'm intrigued by these other concepts of verification besides what might be narrowly considered an audit, so end-to-end auditing, as we heard, or ballot imaging. You know, so an audit is a tool to achieve verification, confidence in accuracy, and so the question is, is that the right tool in the particular place? We might, and for jurisdictions that are already doing audits, I'm not saying stop doing it. If it's achieving your accuracy goals, keep doing it. But if, as we heard from NCSL, not every state is doing risk-limiting audits, and the question is, what should we move to? It seems we should move to a system that we're comfortable with certifying results based on the procedures that we're using.
If I could jump in on that, again, drawing from the CPA side of my brain, I did like the suggestion you said with, in procedural auditing is, we could stagger those, keep them secret as to which one we're going to do, and then, audit the various, components differently. We don't have to do everything every time. But, so I do like that suggestion, yeah.
Over here.
Brenda Cabrera, the City of Fairfax, and I'm an election technician, so I make checklists in my sleep, and I'm very, very process-oriented. Just tell me what you want me to do and how to do it, and so forth. And so for my colleagues, my question is, when we're talking about these partnerships, really, how do I go about, at the local level and state level, forming partnerships with academics who have no money, and I have no money? Really, how do we do that? Because I want to do that. I want to pilot for you. I want to I want to do all those things. How do I do that?
So, I mean, my sense is that Charles runs something of a clearinghouse, or one of the goals. I mean, you speak for this, but one of the goals of this whole election science field of inquiry is to match researchers with folks, and so I don't want to answer for Charles, but I think there's a goal. Yeah.
So I'm looking for a broader, too. Just, I mean, Charlie, I think, was saying, find a dean. Okay, so, how do we do that when you have no money?
Well, I think, and others should speak, but I think it matters what the nature of the partnerships is. So some partnerships can be relatively small, I don't know, small scale, but like what Mike Alvarez was talking, hey, I'm going to partner with one particular jurisdiction to do a study. Other partnerships could be much bigger. So in addition to the American Law Institute that I mentioned, there's another entity called the Uniform Law Commissioners. So if there was anything in this field that the field as a whole thought should be standardized across the country and that should be put into, like throughout yesterday and today, we need a law on this. We need to put this into the law. We need to interface what we do in practice with what the laws is. If the judgment of the community is that that standardization should be across the country, then I would say something called the Uniform Law Commissioners would be the perfect entity to partner with to get those uniform standards. So the nature of the partnership may be tailored to what the particular goal is.
So, from my perspective, I don't have any money either. They tell me the Department of Homeland Security does. I don't know. But you have folks in this room in the nonprofit world outside of just academia. You have the Sherpa of RLAs sitting in front of you. That's a catchy title. You should really use that. But the idea here, to me, if I were sitting in your shoes and having been at least at, you have to get buy-in and support from the or cross collaboration. So I'm sitting here listening to this saying what we need is checklists, right? You're exactly correct. Election officials love checklists. I think Jennifer either has or is working a checklist, right? So we got checklists. All right, now how do we implement it and train on it? Well, we have CTCL here somewhere. What do they do really well? They train local election officials in simple election terms to help educate and carry that message on those checklists. We have Maurice here who's doing training on local election. And so I think part of our role at DHS, to be honest, is to help lead and collaborate with all these folks so that those efforts, instead of being disparate or coordinated, so that you as an election official can get the support you need to then, because in the end, what we recognize in elections, and I think those that have worked in elections recognize, then you become the Sherpa to the next group that wants to do it. Because election officials, you know, are going to trust each other to do this. And so I think what you're asking for is that cross-collaboration across many of those people that are sitting in this room right now to be able to carry to you exactly what you need to do to implement it. You know, someone should pay Hillary Hall right now to tour the country and share her 10 years worth of experiences to help do this, right? She speaks your language when it comes to this, working with Jennifer to do this. Again, I don't have any money, but.
Go ahead. Sure.
Way up in the back. The Gronky.
Can I add one sentence to one answer to the question?
Sure.
So,
well, Gronky.
just to respond to the,
No, Gronky, you have to ask a question.
no, I'm not going to. It's an answer. So one, you want to talk to the
Charles,
people.
I tried.
You want to talk to the people here. Academics are a cheap date. Okay, so talk to us about the incentives that we can help you provide to the There are going to be academics in your area. What can you do? I mean, the reason so many people work with in Colorado really goes back to Scott Doyle in Larimer County and knowing Bob Stein. There wasn't funding initially for this. So you can get, it's not the funding. You need to be transparent. You need to be willing to release data, but I'm telling you, there are, you know, so I have a number of undergraduates who are just dying to do these. They love the projects working with the folks here because they see that as really making a difference, because later they're going to be working in industry where the stuff that they're doing is a lot less interesting. So believe me, we have the personnel, we have the students, the undergraduates and the graduate students. They are looking for projects. Michael has brought his graduate student here for a reason. So it doesn't really require money for a lot of what you need to do. Just talk to us. We can match you, and we can help you craft the questions that you want answered in a way that fit the academic incentives. But the grant funding is not really required.
Just to follow up on this, and then I'm going to pass it to you because we apparently have our own CNN correspondent in here. Our own Jim Acosta up there. At least you didn't have to wrestle for the microphone. Okay. Yeah, learn what many academics have learned, which is college students come cheap. But we just did a big project here's all of our polling places in Chicago, okay? A lot of them are not accessible under the ADA. How do we turn to the law schools in Chicago, and we turn to the Bar Association in Chicago. They put together a training platform. We trained all of these volunteer law students who came out on election day and did surveys of all of our polling places. So now we know which are accessible and which we're going to have to kick off the books and try to consolidate. So yeah, and the universities love putting their students to this kind of work. So, and
I had a quick point. I think the core of the problem that you're mentioning is there's not enough money to do all the things we want to do. One thing I deeply believe, and one thing we're trying to do with VotingWorks, is I think the price of voting machines is way too high. And I think we're spending way too much money on voting machines that are not working well enough. Well, you can clap, it's okay. So I want to be a force in dropping the price of voting machines dramatically. So there's more money for pilots, more money for RLAs, more money for other things. Right in front.
So Harvey Branscombe, I'm from Colorado. I'm electionquality.com. Matt Masterson said that we should not move the goalposts. And we've also understood here that the RLA is a tabulation audit. It's not an audit of many other components of the election. And yet I hear people of great influence describing the RLA as confirming outcomes. And I'm wondering if we can agree to ask those people to lay off describing the RLA that way in order to leave room for us to actually achieve these other audits that need to take place.
Ned, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that question, because the one sentence that I wanted to add was to pick up on the point that I think Philip and Whitney and maybe others said, that the audit is only good as the inputs, right? And if there are problems with the inputs, because there's been a problem with voter registration or with districting or with the nature of the absentee ballot system, confirming that the tabulator is counting accurately is not confirming the integrity of the election. So it seems to me that one major takeaway of this conference is that the concept of the audit needs to be expanded beyond just verifying that the counting is accurate to verifying that the election is accurate.
All right, I'd like to thank our panelists. And back to you, Charles.
Last little bits before we let people get out of the room. The first thing I wanted to do, some thanks and then just a few really quick next steps. First of all, I would like, some people today, for instance, were thanking me and Jennifer, and that's all fine, but we did have a program committee, and I'd like to thank the program committee and the PIs on this project, Mike Alvarez, Philip Stark, Ron Revest, and Jennifer, the entire crew who put together this program. I'm really proud of what we did, but it couldn't have happened by just one person doing this, and so I'd like to thank them for all their work. But God knows none of this would have happened without other people. And I'd just also like to thank, first of all, Claire DeSoy, who we had the MIT crew of Alexander, Jacob, and Catherine who are around, who've been schlepping things around. And so really thank you all, and thank everybody in the room. And actually, there have been an order of magnitude more people watching this on the live stream too. So I'd like to thank the folks at home for squirrel. So just a couple of more words about kind of next steps and things. There's a website. All of y'all in the room know about the website. It currently has some resources about RLAs. We're going to, over the next few weeks, we're going to be beefing it up. We will be having the slides available. We will be having the webcasts available for people who want to revisit this wonderful moment, these wonderful moments. We will be having posting up readings and trying to accumulate highlight a wide variety of resources. We know there are other efforts going on in this space as well, and let a thousand flowers bloom. And I know over the next several weeks and months, we'll be trying to point people to those efforts as well. And so, but watch our website for more information. We're also going to be gathering together more resources, and and those of us who organized this event need to regroup and think about next steps. But we've been recording, basically summarizing what's been going on, and there'll be likely some written product that comes out of this that reflects more broadly on the issues that have been raised, and again, try to move this along, not only as practice but also as science, and to develop the whole area. Actually, before I say that, one thing I learned today is I now have to live in fear that I'll be walking down the street one day and I'll see somebody who looks like Matt. And it won't be Matt. It'll be instead somebody who'll be asking about my feelings.
Terrifying?
No, I can't imagine your warm and fuzzy doppelganger out there. Yeah, that's kind of.
He has a haircut similar to yours. So
Okay, good. We'll compare barbers. Okay, so the last thing is, again, the farmer and the cowman can be friends. One of the goals of this conference, and I think it has paid off because I've heard it in the hallways and I've seen it myself personally, is on the building of this network of election officials, academics, the public, trying to work in this space of auditing and verifiability. And I think this conference will have been a failure if there are not more collaborations that come out. And so I want to encourage those collaborations that are borning from this meeting. And I hope that in the future we can have more, maybe have some failure conferences, maybe have some other things to get together. But to get this community together of a wide variety of perspectives, because I think this is exactly what this space needs. So again, safe travels home. Keep things up. If there is something that's come from this that you think that we could help provide you with, resources, connections, etc., please feel free to contact us. We're going to try to keep the party going. So thank y'all.